Georg Lukács's Road to Art and Marx. Arpad Kadarkay. University of Puget Sound. Today Lukács is generally recognized as a major figure in contemporary Marxism. However, little attention has been paid to his pre-Marxist thought. In this article, Arpad Kadarkay traces Lukács's intellectual aesthetic journey to Marx through his cultural despair over man's alienation from normative values and his eschatological expectation of a world without sin. Analyzing Lukács's preoccupation with the tragic, the author draws a parallel between the young Lukács and Nietzsche and identifies the influence on him of the thought of Kierkegaard. He concludes with a critical assessment of Lukács's concept of art and aesthetics and finds an internal consistency and continuity between the pre-Marxist and the Marxist Lukács. Born in Hungary, Arpad Kadarkay received the Ph.D. from the University of California at Santa Barbara. At present, he is teaching at the University of Puget Sound. He has written and published several papers on Lukács. His forthcoming publications include books on Georg Lukács, the tragic hero and human rights in American and Russian political thought. One man lifts the burden of his age and hurls it down the chasm of his heart. Rainer Maria Rilke. Every serious human being has but one thought. Indeed, the concept of thought may not possess a plural at all. Lukács. To sketch the intellectual stages of Lukács's road to Marxism and analyze his concept of art within the scope of an article is like solving the riddle of the Sphinx. In the old fable, the Sphinx sat by the wayside propounding its riddle to the curious. If they could not answer, they were destroyed. Such a Sphinx, pitiless and crouching on a Marxist pedestal, is Lukács. Lukács's road to Marx and his aesthetics confront the analyst with a twofold problem. First, Lukács's thought is not only complex and enigmatic, but its range is wide. His work, when collected and edited, will comprise some 40 volumes written over 70 years of a somewhat Faustian existence, encyclopedic knowledge, vita activa, and wagers. Second, the promising academic career of young Lukács, a close friend and star pupil of Max Weber, came to an end when he joined the newly formed Hungarian Communist Party in December 1918. The dramatic parting of Weber and Lukács occurred in 1919. Lecturing on Politics as a Vocation, 1919, in Munich, Weber had Lukács in mind when questioning the inner poise of those virtuoso intellectuals of a cosmic love who forget that politics is made with the head, not with the soul. Following the Communist Revolution in Budapest, 1919, to which Lukács imparted a messianic, utopian direction, Weber wrote to his former friend in 1920. "My dear friend, we are naturally separated by our political views. I am absolutely convinced that these experiments will only have one effect, to discredit socialism for the coming 100 years. One Lukács's communism raises the difficult question of the continuity of his thought. My principal thesis is that Lukács's conversion from scholar to revolutionary does not constitute a fundamental break in his thought and perspective on art. Second, there is both unity and continuity between the pre-Marxist and the Marxist Lukács. Third, though Lukács adopts a Marxist perspective on art and culture, his principal works on art, from the Heidelberg manuscripts on aesthetics, 1912, to his Marxist Summa of Aesthetics, entitled Die Eigenart des Ästhetischen, 1963, reveal nonetheless an internal coherence and consistency. In fact, there is textual evidence that Lukács's experimentation with Marxism as a cultural alternative to bourgeois culture predates his conversion. A quasi-Marxist, sociological perspective on art is already evident in his study, Remarks on a Theory of Literary History, 1909, and his first major work, The Historical Development of Modern Drama, 1911, point 2, hereafter cited as Modern Drama. I shall deal with this matter in two parts. The first part traces Lukács's intellectual development by delineating the stages of a troubled man's journey toward Marxism. In the second part I shall attempt a critical evaluation of Lukács's concept of art. Lukács's intellectual road to Marxism is coterminous with his cultural diagnosis of the sickness of fin de siècle civilization. From this despair over the soulless reality is born Lukács's mission to make existence appear intelligible and congruent with the soul. His tragic perception of his age is captured in Yas' lines: things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosened upon the world. 3 In his early works, spanning the years from 1905 to 1917, Lukács perceives reality as devoid of transcendental values and inimical to the actualization of human essence or totality of being. In his important article, The Metaphysics of Tragedy, 1911, Lukács offers a revealing insight into reality, which he finds devoid of redemptive value. Life is chiaroscuro anarchy. Nothing is completely realized and fully accomplished in it. New and dissonant voices constantly disturb the faint voices of the chorus. For he quotes with approval Schelling's negative conclusion about life, where existence is unfit for its essence, sane existence sanum wesen unangemessen ist. 5 And in his modern drama, Lukács postulates the socio-economic base of alienation, which receives its classic expression in his Marxist work, History and Class Consciousness, 1923. As early as in the modern drama, written in 1908 but published in 1911, he wrote, "It is impossible to remain pure in this life because in capitalism everybody is an accomplice in the sin of pursuing money, interest, and power." 6 Consequently, beside the chiaroscuro anarchy of life, which offers nothing and confines man to transcendental homelessness, Lukács juxtaposes the reality of miracle. The concept of miracle, emblematic of God, not only introduces new possibilities into life but it terminates the heterogeneous continuity of reality, 7 which was opposed by the Neo-Kantians, particularly Heinrich Rickert, in the name of the unity of human spirit. The Neo-Kantian Lukács even invokes God's aid in drawing up a metaphysical indictment of historical reality. Before God, there is no difference between appearance and essence, phenomena and idea, actuality and destiny. The question of value and reality loses all its meaning. Before God, value creates reality, rather than to be dreamed of or explained into reality. 8. Evidently, Lukács's transvaluation of the soulless and sinful civilization, where men's souls never walked in greater loneliness, is conditioned by ethical religious considerations. One could, in fact, compile a small glossary of religious images and motifs from Lukács's early writings. Just to mention a few, Lukács's image of the dialogue of naked souls with naked destiny is straight out of Dante's Inferno, 14:14. In his evocative intellectual poems. 9. As he called his essays In the Soul and the Forms, Hungarian ed. 1911, he refers to the voice of God that slumbers inside every man. He prefers the truth of myth to ordinary truth, and sees in mystical ecstasy the means to overcome empirical life. Lukács's intimate friend, Béla Balázs, 1884–1949, made several entries in his diary in 1911 concerning Lukács's intense preoccupation with religion and the concept of God-man. The latter, of course, plays an important role in Kierkegaard, whose influence on his early works even the Marxist Lukács acknowledged, even when he disavowed his philosophical youth. To Kierkegaard, God-man conveys the unity of ethics, God, and aesthetics, man. But more important from our perspective, the notion of Christ as God-man suggests that man can overcome the all-pervasive relativism and diversity of modern life. It is the latter meaning Lukács had in mind when he confided to Balázs that only God-man can assume form amidst life's chiaroscuro anarchy. Lukács even found that evil had a place in religion, inasmuch as evil, as he put it, is but chaos, a life not taking form. 10. It seems paradoxical that God should have played such an important role in young Lukács's intellectual outlook. But the paradox is resolved if we realize his intense preoccupation, on which I shall comment later, with the concept of tragedy and the tragic element in life. Lukács was only 24 years old when he defined drama as the mystical duel between man and his destiny. 11. His own life embodies tragedy. Here is a sensitive being caught in a culture which, despite its cultivation of the aesthetic psychic states of the self, was devoid of human essence or total perspective. he is forced to live out his life in conflict with reality. The essence Lukács craves can come only from an extraneous source, God or mysticism. Nietzsche has proclaimed that God is dead. No matter, Lukács seeks alternatives either in the Fichtean ego, Kantian ethics, or the Russian God of Dostoevsky. Since each of these concepts are extraneous to the reality they are supposed to comprehend and remedy, Lukács's metaphysical search continues until he makes his wager on communism. A careful study of Lukács's early writings, combined with his confessional correspondence with Leo Popper XII, 1886–1911, and Balash's diary entries, enables us to trace the Socratic Kierkegaardian Dostoevskian stages of Lukács's road to Marxism. First, there is Lukács's Socratic quest to realize his soul, then the Kierkegaardian wager on an idea that would redeem man, and finally his Dostoevskian reconstruction of the sinful world. It is not difficult to see that the Socratic Kierkegaardian Dostoevskian stages of Lukács's journey toward Marxism, marked as they are by cultural despair over man's alienation and eschatological expectation of a new world, are of the genus of existentialism made popular by, among others, Kierkegaard, Martin Heidegger, and Karl Jaspers. 13 But whereas for Kierkegaard tragedy resides in the unsurpassable opaqueness of the lived experience, for Lukács the tragedy of a particular life can and must be surpassed. Convinced that transcendental homelessness is not man's permanent abode, he pinned his hopes on Hegelian history and Marxist revolution. In both, the tragedy of a particular life is always surpassed from the point of view of the totality. At the same time, there are subtle differences between Lukács's existentialism and, for instance, that of Jaspers. Though to Lukács the individual soul is the only authentic reality that can overcome alienation, he nonetheless associates individualism with the metaphysical tragedy of bourgeois culture. That tragedy resides in the growing loneliness of modern man who, in Lukács's view, is much more lonely than traditional man. 14 In his essayist period the dominant theme is loneliness and a desperate search for that life form that would overcome the heterogeneous duality of I and the world. 15 And thus, either through art or metaphysics, expand the soul into a cosmos. Not surprisingly, Lukács's essays In the Soul and the Forms, hereafter cited as the soul, give lyrical expression to his personal longing for value and form, for measure and order. 16 Moreover, consistent with the neoclassicism of German idealism, Lukács revitalizes the coherent world of Socrates and Plato. In the modern drama, he draws a sharp contrast between the ancient polis and modernity. For reasons innate in German intellectual history, Germans from Goethe to Hegel and from Marx to Stefan Georg fell prostrate before Hellas. The invasion of German intellectual life by the idealized inhabitants of Greece, though fascinating, cannot detain us here. What is crucial is that Lukács's contemporaries at Heidelberg, such as Emil Lask, Georg Simmel, and Stefan Georg, scorned modern civilization from the perspective of ancient Greece. To Lukács the ancient polis symbolized an organic community whose ideals permeated all important aspects of life. 17 The polis, as he put it, tolerated neither debate nor doubt. 18 Greek antiquity, unlike modern civilization, was not shaken and transformed by material things. Lukács expressed the contrast in a paradigm. Once upon a time life was itself individualistic. Today it is human beings who are individualistic. Greek individualism was spontaneous and uniform, whereas modern individualism is conscious and problematic. 19. To Lukács, ancient Hellas was the very antinomy of bourgeois society. In his important work, The Theory of the Novel, hereafter cited as the Novel, drafted in 1914, he makes the most passionate apotheosis of classical Hellas since Johann Winckelmann and Lessing. There is an internal unity between Lukács's essays and his Dostoevskian book, The Novel. The latter diagnoses alienation from the aesthetic perspective of Schiller and from the philosophical Hegelian perspective of spirit, Geist. The aesthetic indictment of modernity is explicit in Schiller's Ode to the Gods of Greece. Life's fullness flowed through creation and there felt what never more will feel. Man acknowledged a higher nobility in nature. When Lukács traces the growing alienation of man, pointing out that the Greeks knew only perfection while modern man knows only paradox, 20 he is merely restating the central theme of Hegel's phenomenology of mind, namely that the polis is the only ethical home to which alienated modem man can return. In sum, a dramatized account of the classical polis shows up the mediocrity and mendacity of modernity. Lukács's essays are suffused with an awareness that bourgeois life, in a phrase Weber borrowed from Schiller, the disenchantment of the world, contains the seeds of its decline. The source of this pre-Marxist thought is Lukács's tragic vision of life combined with his resolute attempt to find non-tragic solutions to the problem it poses. Lukács's tragic vision is inseparable from his total alienation from the fin de siècle civilization which, particularly in Austria-Hungary, by spinning out of orbit sets the stage for his concept of tragedy, namely man's tragic collision and defiant struggle with reality and fate. In addition, the troubled man also suffers the tragedy of being impelled to travel the road from dissonance to essence or form. 2. What is significant in this context is Lukács's inversion of the Nietzschean concept of the tragic. As has been indicated, the juxtaposition of perfect Hellas and disenchanted modernity is Lukács's way to convey the metaphysical tragedy of human existence arising from bourgeois culture's betrayal of its classical ideals. By projecting his own alienation as the existential base of modern man, Lukács can treat the tragic as something integral to human consciousness. So far his position is not so different from Nietzsche's in the birth of tragedy. Indeed, there are remarkable parallels between the young Lukács and Nietzsche. Just to mention a few. 21 While Nietzsche inveighs against man's tragic dependency on art, Lukács denounces the Luciferian art, meaning art's audacity to offer a successful solution to God's own tension. Like Nietzsche, Lukács defines the drama as the poetry of will and sees struggle as the most expressive form of will. 22 In his article, They Fear Health, 1910, Lukács takes a Nietzschean stand against the leveling and diminution of values. From Plato through Christianity and from Spinoza through Hegel, every great thinker had agonized over how to explain the bad, the base, and imperfect in order to understand the possibility of his own existence. Today the relationship is reversed. Our age views the base as natural and, inevitably, the pathological becomes the normative. 23 Even more revealing is Lukács's critical rejection of socialism on grounds that basically are Nietzschean. He scorns the inner debacle of those who, by escaping into socialism, give testimony of their inability to obey the iron necessity of tragic loneliness to which their inner spiritual strength predestines them. 24 To the lofty expectation that by joining socialism one serves progress, Lukács responds that it is the salvation of those who crave quietude and certainty anywhere and at any price. But if socialism cannot resolve man's dissonance, what can? Lukács's answer in the 1910s is still that of a man determined to seek salvation on his own. Everybody struggles inwardly and for himself. Communities are formed when the truly great men's understanding of the problem of their own life and life's problem is so deep, as to obliterate all differences between men according to their individuality. 25 Lukács here implies a connection between life and the tragic on the basis of the historical situation. Confronted with his own inner struggle, he is aware that the quest for personal salvation involves the possibility of failure or tragic fall. Yet it is the mark of Lukács's genius that, though influenced by Nietzsche, he contradicts him on 2 points. First, reflecting on Nietzsche's dictum that since God is dead the meaning of life must be sought elsewhere, Lukács retorts, what if one God died and another, a younger and different kind of God, who relates to us differently, is being born? What if our purposeless darkness is but the dusk between one God's twilight and another God's dawn? Wouldn't then the tragic hero become the paradigm of the rebel, Antichrist, and Lucifer? Is it certain that here in the God-shattered tragic world we discovered the ultimate meaning? And isn't our loneliness a form of agonized cry and yearning for the coming God? 26 Second, Lukács reverses the Nietzschean tragic order that the exceptional being, who leaves the human herd and its God-given values, is the condition of tragic fall or sacrifice. To Lukács, who seeks destiny in forms, 27 modeled either after Socrates or delivered by the coming God. Tragic sacrifice on behalf of the coming collectivity is the necessary condition of the exceptional being. This reversal defines Lukács's spiritual intellectual revolution, from which the road leads to his historical revolution of 1918 to 1919. By invalidating the Nietzschean concept of the tragic, Lukács commits himself to Kierkegaard's either-or choice, through which the individual can transcend not only his own limits but, in Simmel's terms, the tragedy of civilization. 28. Before considering Lukács's discovery of Kierkegaard, it seems appropriate to introduce the personal problems of Lukács, the troubled man. In 1907 he met Irma Seidler, whose love, by his own admission, was to be his whole life. Yet he deliberately contrived to advise Kierkegaard that this love was to remain an aesthetic philosophic longing and suffering. His luminous essay, Kierkegaard and Rugine Olsen, 29, merely masks his own involvement with Irma Seidler. When she broke off relations with him, he wrote, "There are beings to whom, in order that they may become great, everything even faintly resembling happiness and sunshine must always be forbidden." 30. After the separation, Lukács's essays are suffused with longing and loneliness. His soulmate, Leo Popper, warned him about his growing lyrical inversion. In 1909 Popper wrote to his friend, "For 6 months do not write about isolation. And write no more, Lukács." Popper also informed him that people already suspect that for him literature is but an occasion for self-portrait. 31. Lukács, in turn, informed Popper that he is grappling with the concept of art as life and life as art, and the ironic distance from reality, as did Kierkegaard. Then Lukács adds the revealing note, "You should sense that all these questions I am discussing here grew out of my life." 32. Though he has generously acknowledged Popper's influence on his ideas. 33. Lukács nonetheless affirms that my road is really my own. His statement makes it clear that he has indeed reversed the Nietzschean concept of the tragic. Journeying toward my own center, I already know that nobody can share it and nobody can help me there. 34. Lukács's journey toward his own inner self is modeled after Socrates and Kierkegaard. Like Socrates, Lukács listens to his inner voice in becoming an emissary critic sent to the sinful world to judge and transvaluate. Lukács admitted that he started out as an essayist. He defined the essay as a tribunal designed to indict the disjointed world. The very genre of the essay, the principal medium of experimental thinking about fragmentary life, enables the questioning self to be the touchstone for judging culture and reality. Through his essays, Lukács can pursue the Socratic quest to create something out of himself and, at the same time, judge the fragmented reality. In his words, what determines the value of the essay is the process of judging. 35. But Lukács's concept of judging is not without political consequences. In his essayist period, he places, following Kierkegaard, aesthetics in relation to ethics. His main authority is Aristotle, who pointed out that poetry, by employing such ethical distinctions as better and worse, points beyond itself to metaphysical ethical values. Lukács, however, goes much further. By associating the essence of art with the imposition of form, he in effect invests art with the power of overcoming opposition and, most extraordinary of all, of imposing a yoke on hostile forces. 36. This radical concept of form enables him, prior to his Marxism, to impart revolutionary design to art. He formulated his radical theory of art in 1910 when he asserted, "Forming is the last judgment over things. This last judgment means the redemption of everything redeemable, and it imposes redemption on everything by a divine force." 37. There is an internal consistency between Lukács's demiurgic imposition of form on recalcitrant matter and his Marxist rationale for the historical necessity of violence, which he developed in History and Class Consciousness. In analyzing the historical use of violence, Lukács concluded, in contrast to Weber, that violence in service of a principle confers a new function on it because violence is now put in the service of man and the flowering of man. 38. There is a coherent pattern in his imposition of form on chaotic life and his transformation of the demiurge into a proletarian will to universality. It is interesting to note that Weber treated legitimate violence as integral to the political process. Consequently, he rejected Lukács's Marxist interpretation that violence, expressing the proletariat's will to salvation, is really not violence but a leap into salvation. Lukács and Weber parted company precisely over the former's wager that the salvation of one's soul is possible through revolutionary politics. Weber had Lukács in mind when he wrote, "He who seeks salvation of the soul, of his and others, should not seek it along the avenue of politics, for the quite different tasks of politics can only be solved by violence." 39 Even Lukács's contemporaries and friends have recognized his conversion to Marxism as analogous to the Kierkegaardian moment when man, striving for the truth which is God, faces an either-or choice. He can neither probe God's existence through reason which, despite Spinoza, cannot provide proof of God's existence, or set reason aside and reach God by a leap of faith. Thus Lukács's leap into communism presupposes the repudiation of an intellectual understanding of Marxism. In analyzing Kierkegaard's leap of faith, by means of which he leaves the relative facts of life to reach the absolute certainty of form, Lukács argues that such an act is always irrational because the supremacy of thought must yield ground to faith if the new is to come forward. Nonetheless, he concedes that Kierkegaard had honesty because, like Lukács in 1918, he saw the crossroads and walked to the end of the road he had chosen. 40 Ervin Sinko, actively involved in the Hungarian Soviet Republic, wrote a novel memoir, Optimistke, Optimists, where the revolutionary Lukács, in the figure of Wiertz, is depicted as a Kierkegaardian character. According to Sinko, Lukács argued that knowledge of Marxism or class consciousness are too rational to explain the irrationality of sacrificing one's life for a cause. To believe, Lukács declared, means that one deliberately assumes an irrational attitude toward his own individual existence. 41 He illustrates this through the paradox of Hamlet, whose will is paralyzed because he only knows and lacks faith. Knowledge immobilizes through skepticism. Faith, on the other hand, is neither childish nor comic. On the contrary, Lukács asserts, faith is a Promethean reality, and without Golgotha there is no heaven. 42 Lukács concludes his autopsy of faith, The Road to Communism, by recommending to its rational converts that, if the question interests you and you find some time, read Kierkegaard. I have a strong suspicion that he himself lacked faith. Yet I know of no one who perceived more clearly than he the decisive importance, the inaccessibility of faith. 43 To put Lukács's leap of faith into perspective, two final points should be made. Balázs left a testimony that among the exiled Hungarian communists in Vienna, Lukács was the only true communist because he chose sin and carried it through. Lukács, said Balázs, lived his ethics not unlike the philosopher of religion, Kierkegaard, who calculated God without actually living him. 44. The second relevant point about Lukács's Kierkegaardian path to Marxism is what Balázs called the problem of communism. The problem is twofold. First, as Balázs put it, the Kierkegaardian individual ethics brought us to the point of committing ourselves to a movement that precludes individual ethics. Second, Lukács and his circle saw two roads to human progress, the evolution of classes and the realization of the soul. Though the two roads can be separate, Balázs concludes that in us the roads crossed each other. 45 So far we have traced Lukács's Socratic Kierkegaardian journey toward his own center, which also points toward Marxism. Lukács's position up to 1914 is best summarized by his own statement that, what I am doing is inverted Platonism. 46 This refers to his attempt to create what he called the palace of ideals here on earth. Whereas to Plato art is superficial, in Lukács's inverted Platonism philosophy is superficial. Inverted Platonism suggests that in an alienated world only art can fulfill man's deepest needs and satisfy his longings for form. Whereas philosophy interprets the world, art creates the world anew. Lukács attempts the radical redemption of the world first by art then by revolution. To Lukács art and revolution do not involve two incompatible values. On the contrary, his inverted Platonism and the subsequent discovery of Dostoevsky's New World are but parallel lanes of his road to Marxism. From Kierkegaard he learns that the tragic collision of values in a sick civilization compels the individual, who values his soul, to choose values. But the choice of values, or truth as personal existence, confronts the individual with the agonizing question of what value to choose. It is hardly accidental that during his essayist period Lukács sees normative values in spiritual figures like Master Eckhart, Francis of Assisi, Kierkegaard, and, incredible as it sounds, the theosophist Helena Blavatsky. In one way or other, these mystics transcended what Ernst Bloch, Lukács's kindred spirit at Heidelberg, called the stupid status quo. 47 It is also noteworthy that in 1911 Lukács founded a journal called Zalem, the Spirit. Its contributors, including the young Mannheim, were dubbed as Zalemkek, Hungarian diminutive for spirit. The journal, which folded after 2 issues, was dedicated to the proposition that metaphysical speculation is as natural to man as breathing. By 1914, however, the spiritual revolution is behind Lukács, and Kierkegaard yields to sacred Dostoevsky, the creator of a new world by new means. In his book, The Novel, Lukács moves from individual to social redemption. By 1914 he perceived the present as pregnant with the future. He wrote, "Motor loneliness is not simply the intoxication of a soul gripped by destiny and so made song, it is also the torment of a creature condemned to solitude and devoured by a longing for community." 48 The longing for community now begins to haunt Lukács's writings, full of a homeless man's hunger for meaning. This thirst for community, exemplified in Dostoevsky's mystical humanum, had a profound implication for Lukács's intellectual development. The community he strives for, in effect, is non-empirical because it resolves itself into Dostoevsky's chiastic empire of naked souls against naked reality. 4. From the latter the pathway leads straight to Lukács's messianic Marxism. At this point we must return to Lukács's involvement with Irma Seidler. His holy scream for community, to borrow Popper's apt phrase, cannot be understood apart from Lukács's spiritual crisis in 1911. In that year Irma Seidler committed suicide, and a few months later Leo Popper died. Both events had a shattering impact on Lukács. After her tragic death she jumped into the Danube. He wrote, "The loneliness I craved has now collapsed on me like life's judgment. If anybody could have saved her it was I, and I neither wanted nor could I do it. I know, I was her good friend, but I wanted something more. And for that I lacked deeds." With this the judgment is pronounced. 50 Lukács not only dedicated the German edition of The Soul to Irma Seidler, but her death inspired his philosophical dialogue, The Poverty of Spirit, 1912, by far his most autobiographical work. Even Weber was impressed by Lukács's profound artistic essay on the poor in spirit. 51 We know that between Irma Seidler's suicide and the completion of The Poverty of Spirit Lukács himself contemplated suicide. This work, in essence, is his philosophical confession of what he tried to overcome in his own life. From our perspective, the work's seminal importance is this: first, it brings to a close Lukács's essayist period and, at the same time, charts his Dostoevskyan phase of development, 1912-1918. Second, in his philosophical confession Lukács bears witness against the poverty of spirit in Kantian ethics. Lukács's critical expose of asceticism in The Poverty of Spirit has autobiographical and political significance. In his essays, reminiscent of Nietzsche, Lukács suggests that Xanthippe was inimical to Socrates' philosophical pursuits. Lukács himself was inclined to asceticism. In his younger years he had contemplated joining a monastery. Asceticism provided him with the condition most favorable to the exercise of his intelligence. He states candidly that placing work above life is the cause of the human tragedy. The realization of perfection, he wrote, is the existence of tragic man. 52. He consistently placed work before life. The 86-year-old Lukács died at his desk correcting his last work, The Ontology of Social Being, 1978. However, there is something more to Lukács's serene asceticism than a mere hubris, periat mundus, fiat philosophia. In 1910 he wrote, "I become really patient, I tolerate people. Only one thing counts, are they in any way my kindred spirit in that struggle that will fill my life?" 93 The struggle that filled his life, at least since 1924, coincided with Stalinism and its complex legacy. As a result, his Marxist works are full of polynodes and retractions, disavowals, and repent-ins. And it is during the Stalinist period that Lukács's impersonal attitude toward his own life assumes political significance. The primacy of obra over persona, with its denial of persona the Spinozan amor dei intellectualis, enables Lukács to disavow with perfect sincerity and logic his idealistic youth and its works. This relentless searcher of the innermost essence of the soul could, when serving Stalinism, argue that a person is not identical with his truth. To reach this Kierkegaardian position, Lukács had to struggle through the Kantian solution of the relation between objective-subjective factors of history and arrive at Hegel's formula that a person is only a vehicle of an impersonal spirit. How this inner drama realizes itself in Lukács's late works is of minor importance and cannot detain us here. What is important, however, is Lukács's attempt in The Poverty of Spirit to replace the ascetic ideal with a social ideal. With merciless honesty, he displays his raving madness for work even when it runs counter to Kant's categorical imperative, act so that you treat humanity, always as an end, never as a means only. The idea that man is an end, something whose worth is not dependent on what we can use him for, is the most important moral presupposition of all. But Lukács used Irma Seidler as a means to his own end. Since in a God-forsaken world the violation of the moral order is denied transcendental atonement, the philosopher-poet in The Poverty of Spirit commits suicide. With a profound grasp of his own guilt, Lukács wrote, "To her silent cry for help, I turned a deaf ear. I clung to the joyful tone of her letters. Please do not say, I could not have known. Perhaps it is true. But I should have known it." 54 Here then is Lukács's indictment of that heterogeneous world where two beings, occupying a separate sphere of reality, she the all-too-human world of love and he the world of inverted Platonism, are unable to communicate from soul to soul. Consequently, in his philosophical dialogue, Lukács denies life to the ascetic hero who, by shooting himself, symbolizes Lukács's own denouement at the level of ascetic ideal. At the same time, the demise of the ascetic ideal becomes an occasion for him to project an alternative life form. Thus when the philosopher-poet shoots himself, he leaves on his desk the Bible, opened at the revelation of St. John at 3:15-16. Here the angel reproaches the church of the Laodiceans for sheltering those who burn neither hot nor cold. With Lukács's scriptural account of the conversion and epiphany of a sinner, we are in the presence of Dostoevsky's God-haunted creation, a world without tragedy. The formal Kantian ethic is replaced by the concept of the grace of goodness, embodied in such Dostoevskyan heroes as Prince Miskin and Alyosha. Lukács defines the grace of goodness as the true homecoming of man to humanity. 55 Only goodness, he argues, can overcome the Kantian ethics which doomed Irma Seidler and, symbolically, the ascetic Lukács. The devaluation of Kantian ethics is complete when Lukács embraces the Dostoevskyan eschatology of pure grace. The good man does not interpret the other man's soul. He reads it like his own and thus becomes one with the other. This is the miracle of goodness. 56 In the novel, featuring Dostoevsky, Lukács delineates the new spirit of destiny for the troubled man. Kant's starry firmament now shines only in the dark night of pure cognition, it no longer lights the solitary wanderer's path. 57. Incontestably, Dostoevsky marks a decisive stage in Lukács's progress toward Marxism. It was Nietzsche, of course, who first discovered Dostoevsky, the prophet of the Russian God. Under the influence of Dostoevsky, Nietzsche calls Christ an interesting decadent and refers to Jesus, in Dostoevsky's sense, as an idiot. 58 But the German fascination with Dostoevsky and Russia goes beyond Nietzsche. Given Lukács's deep roots in German culture, a few observations are in order on the subtle interplay of German and Russian thought evident even in Rosa Luxemburg, who cast a strong spell on young Lukács. In the early 20th century there is a curious nostalgia among German intellectuals, disenchanted with the impersonal spheres of modern Western rationalism, for the inner-worldly and theocentric Russian culture. Weber himself respected the Russian religious attitude as one possible alternative to a disenchanted world and was fascinated by Russian mystics, particularly Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. He even admired the Russian revolutionaries' readiness to die for a cause. 59 Moreover, preoccupied with the process of rationalization in modern life, Weber was interested in Russian development as a possible alternative to the Western model. In addition to Weber, there is Oswald Spengler who, in his bestseller The Decline of the West, 1918, refers to Dostoevsky as the embodiment of the coming Russia. To Spengler, Dostoevsky was the opposite of Faustian civilization, which is technologically bloated but spiritually impoverished. Not surprisingly, Chapter 9 of The Decline is entitled, On the Form of the Soul. What Spengler was referring to was the brother world 60 as opposed to the Faustian I. But in addition to the German inquiry into Dostoevsky, Lukács's choice was also influenced by his total alienation from Hungarian reality. Karl Mannheim, 1893–1947, expressed best what Dostoevsky meant to Lukács and his Sunday circle, known as Zelemkek. Mannheim had just turned 19 when he acknowledged the dizzying depths of Lukács's essays and referred to their great togetherness in searching for an immanent worldview in life. Like Lukács, Mannheim wants to write on Dostoevsky, who revealed the laws of happiness. In 1912 Mannheim wrote to Lukács, "I feel that knowledge of his life Dostoevsky promises solutions. His life and his world are very similar to ours in all their vicissitudes, in all their lack of fulfillment and their distortions. I feel that two men are very much part of our own times, Dostoevsky and Audi. Is there anyone whose life allows us to learn more than theirs?" 61. Endre Audi, 1877–1919, is the greatest lyricist of modern Hungarian literature. In his new poems, 1906, he sounded the tocsin on the cursed Hungarian reality. Not only was Lukács one of the first to recognize Audi's genius and revolutionary tone, but also admitted that what he could not understand in Marx, despite several readings, he understood immediately in Audi's poems. 62 Lukács saw Audi as a revolutionary without revolution. Audi's poetry was indeed revolutionary. He declared, "I am a protesting faith. A messianic veto." 63. Whereas Kant wrote sublimely on the thing in itself and Hegel counseled compromise with reality, Audi saw only a cemetery of souls in the Hungarian wasteland. His apocalyptic vision is searing. All is vain, we plummet down, to be swallowed by death lake. In vain our soul, our passions. We cannot conquer this death lake, this Hungary. 64. Nothing was sacred to Audi. Not even apostolic Hungary, against which he flaunted his beautiful pagan soul. 65 And proclaimed the need for revolutionary regeneration. Lukács had no difficulties to see in Audi's messianism a promise of socialism. Like Lukács, Audi searched restlessly to find the form for his troubled soul. In Audi's lines, how long, how long? The old fate, the ancient curse. Delaying, somnolent red sun. I beseech you. Rise, O rise, sacred red Sunday. 66. Lukács found here what he could not understand in Marx. Audi and Dostoevsky took Lukács by storm. Both confronted man, as Lukács put it, with an absolute and created a new world for humanity's bad conscience. Dostoevsky's dramatis personae as well as Audi's new poems coexist in the nakedness of the Last Judgment. Just how much Dostoevsky meant to Lukács can be inferred from the fact that he shelved his work on aesthetics that he had started in Florence in 1911–1912 and, despite Weber's objections, immersed himself in Dostoevsky. In his Economy and Society, written between 1910–1913, Weber, though acknowledging Dostoevsky's and Tolstoy's influence on Western intellectuals, still voices doubts about the Russian mystic's new religion. In Weber's view, no new religion has ever resulted from such needs of intellectuals or from their chatter. 67 In a letter to Lukács, Weber expressed similar reservations when he wrote, "Your sudden turn to Dostoevsky appears to verify Emil Lask's view. I hated and still hate this work of yours." 68 Weber was referring to Lukács's The Theory of the Novel, first published in Zeitschrift für Ästhetik und die Allgemeine Kunstwissenschaft, 1916. Lukács never completed his work on Dostoevsky. But what he hoped to find in him is evident from his extensive notes and outlines drafted in 1915. The outline of Chapter 2 of Lukács's projected Dostoevsky book is suggestive. Ch2 The World Without God, Russian and European Atheism, The New Morality, Suicide, Transformation of the World, Jehovah Christianity, The State, Socialism, Loneliness, All is Permitted, The Problem of Terrorism. The whole outline is charged with eschatological expectation. In Lukács's Dostoevsky draft, European civilization faces the Last Judgment. A comparison with the novel shows that the latter, in essence, is a lengthy preface to the unpublished Dostoevsky book. 3. In the novel, Lukács struggles with two interlocking problems. The Hegelian objective spirit, domiciled in the German state, was waging a war Lukács despised, as did Audien refused to serve. It should be kept in mind that Lukács's choice of Dostoevsky coincides with the Holocaust of 1914. His reaction to 1914 cannot be separated from his total disassociation from the prevailing German view of the war. Karl Polanyi, a close friend of Lukács, wrote that during the Great War he read Hamlet at least 20 times. Like Hamlet, members of the Sunday Circle were haunted by the question, to be or not to be, to choose between life and death, 69 as Polanyi put it. But many of Lukács's German friends and mentors, from Paul Ernst and Thomas Mann to Georg Simmel and Max Weber, supported the war either on Kantian or Nietzschean grounds. For instance, in his Betrachtungen eines Unpolitischen, 1918, Mann cited Goethe, Schiller, and Kant to prove that the present war was waged in a purely spiritual world. 70 And when Marianne Weber cited individual acts of war heroism, Lukács retorted, "The better the worse. Whichever side wins," he asked himself, "who will save us from Western civilization?" 71 Lukács shared Luxemburg's view that 1914 signaled the reversion to barbarism and the destruction of culture. As Luxemburg put it, either the triumph of imperialism and the destruction of all culture, a vast cemetery, or the victory of socialism. 72 Concerning the war, Lukács took issue even with his admired teacher, Simmel. In a letter to Marianne Weber, August 1914, Simmel wrote that finally in our age the demand of the day and the ideals are identical. Adding that this identity is intuitive and based on personal experience, Simmel remarks that, if Lukács lacks this experience, then it cannot be demonstrated to him. Consequently, Lukács sees militarism in everything which to us, declared Simmel, means the liberation from militarism. 73 The latter concept became a catalyst for Lukács's monograph on the German intelligentsia and the war, unpublished until 1974. 74 What Simmel's phrase conveyed was actually analogous to Weber's stand on the war. All his life Weber adhered to the primacy of the interest of the nation-state. 75 Since the German state was at war, it followed from the Kantian internalized duty that a soldier, like Emil Lask, could realize his individualism in the trenches. When Lask, very close to Lukács at Heidelberg, enlisted in what Weber called the Great and Wonderful War, Weber said it was Lask's duty to enlist. To Lukács, on the other hand, Lask's death in the trenches symbolized the tragic flaw in German values. 7 The Germans pushed individualism to such an extreme that by 1914, in Lukács's term, there was a genuine hunger for the community of all. 2. German intellectuals. The war was an opportunity for what Lukács called the communal togetherness, the collective sharing and overcoming of danger. 77 The amazing aspect of Lukács's critical rejection of the war was that in 1913 he predicted the Germans' lemming plunge into a cause. The editor of L'Effort Libre, Jean-Richard Bloch, submitted a questionnaire to Lukács in 1912, asking him to assess the broad tendencies in German culture and to suggest what new developments he discerned. Lukács's response turned up in the famous Heidelberg suitcase, 78, whose contents are deposited in the Lukács archive. Two things strike us today in Lukács's evaluation, March 1913, of German culture. 79 First, he sketches in somber colors the sterile individualism that stifled German life. Those who sought an escape via democratic socialist ideals were, in Lukács's view, stricken by the poverty of an all-embracing worldview. Second, the disorientation of values was fortunately growing, as was the dissatisfaction with attempts to overcome it. The combined result of the two observations caused Lukács to prophesy that the disoriented, abstract individualism will redeem itself through a religious or collective act. 80 In his response to the questionnaire, Lukács makes the first reference, as far as I can verify, to socialism as a central cultural movement. 81 Foreshadowing the future. Even more significant from our perspective, Lukács intimates in the German intelligentsia and the war the historical road to socialism. It emerges as an alternative to the German ideal type of the new heroism. To Lukács, war heroism negates heroism because, under conditions of modern warfare, it is the duty of every man to attain heroism through technical skills available to all. From his response to Ernst, who insisted that in war the citizen's primary duty is to the state, it is evident that Lukács associated heroism with the trans-historical mission of the soul. Against Ernst, Lukács upholds the supremacy of Seele over Reich. Your remark that the state is a part of the self is correct. What I do not accept is the notion that the state is part of the soul. It is a mistake to convert the self into a soul. Truly speaking, only the soul has metaphysical reality. The problem is to find ways that lead from one soul to another. 82. The road from soul to soul was mapped out by Dostoevsky. But by 1915 Lukács was also experimenting with revolutionary terrorism as a road from loneliness to soul existence, from solitariness to solidarity. In contrast to the German concept of state heroism, he praises the soul heroism of the Russian revolutionaries. The decisive trait of the revolutionary type is that his single interest is the execution of the task and that he is indifferent to the goal or its realization. 83 Indisputably it was Yelena Grabenko, Lukács's Russian-born wife, who drew his attention to Russian revolutionary figures. Her place in Lukács's life sheds a crucial light on the last stage of his journey toward Marxism. Lukács met her after he came away from the edge of damnation, following Irma Seidler's suicide. It is hardly coincidental that no other than Ernst Seidler, Irma's brother and one of the founders of the Hungarian Communist Party, November 1918, personally supervised Lukács's leap from sin to salvation. But to return to Yelena Grabenko, she appears to have stepped out of the pages of Dostoevsky. During the 1905 revolution she carried a baby in her arms borrowed for the occasion, and in the baby's blanket she concealed a bomb. There was something of Dostoevsky's Sonia in her. Imprisoned for her terrorist activities, to Lukács she symbolized the crushed and suffering humanity that, as for Dostoevsky, bears within its soul the undying seeds of joyous resurrection. Yelena Grabenko not only had a hypnotic effect on Lukács but, as Balash attests, she triggered a visionary mechanism in him that surprised Lukács himself. 84 Through her, Lukács not only married Dostoevsky as it were, but her life demonstrated to him convincingly that human redemption is predicated on what existentialism later called unengagement. And by marrying Yelena, Lukács made good his earlier omission of the grace of goodness. Unfortunately for Lukács, even in marriage, Yelena remained a Sonia. She fell in love with a deranged piano player Bruno Steiner because he needed her compassion and pity more than Lukács. Yelena lived with Bruno in an insane asylum. Later, she moved with Bruno into Lukács's apartment in Heidelberg. What transpired in that crammed apartment between the three is worthy of Dostoevsky's pen. Balash had one word for it: a living hell. Nietzsche once said that whoever, at any time, has undertaken to build a new heaven has found the strength for it in his own hell. 85. Reflecting on his self-made hell, Lukács wrote to Balázs, "The great tragedy of an artist is that for his work he forsakes his soul. Faith in the homogeneity of work leads to the freezing of the soul." 86. The breakup of their marriage, 1917, Lukács viewed in Dostoevskian terms. "If I was good," he wrote, "I would have stayed with her." 87. Yelena directed Lukács's interest to the writings of Boris Savinkov, 1879–1925. Under the pseudonym, Vyrobshin, Savinkov wrote The Pale Horse, The Apocalypse, where he sketches the travail of soul in those who know how to die for a cause. Savinkov was something of a Nietzschean Superman with a bomb. He was responsible for the assassination of V.K. Plave, 1904, Minister of Interior, and the Tsar's uncle, Sergei Alexandrovich, 1905. In Savinkov's works, Lukács claimed to learn about the modern Russian soul. In a letter to Ernst, he wrote, "I do not see in Robshin a sign of disease. I discover in him a new form of the old conflict between the first ethic and the second ethic." 88. Lukács's reference to the old conflict between the two ethics is important. It was no other than Weber who drew a distinction between the ethic of ultimate ends, Gesinnungsethik, and the ethic of responsibility. But whereas Weber cautioned his East European students against committing themselves to the ethic of ultimate ends to the exclusion of the ethic of responsibility, Lukács uses Savinkov to invalidate Weber's counsel of moderation. Savinkov's first ethic means a responsibility to society and its institutions. But the second ethic, the equivalent of Weber's Gesinnungsethik, refers to one's duty toward the soul and humanity. Lukács leaves no doubt that the ethic of the soul must supersede the ethic of responsibility. It is precisely the latter that Weber found absent in those who fell under the spell of an apolitical ethos of brotherhood that Lukács found so irresistible in Savinkov. Relying on the ethic of the soul, Lukács can now confront the problem of terror. To a revolutionary, terror and killing are justified because the end is attained by sacrificing one's own soul. Savinkov faces the problem of terror squarely. "To the charge that I killed, I answer, I kill in the name of terror, for the revolution. Who will judge? Who will come forth and declare, killing is forbidden? Do not kill. Why is it that for terror you kill, for truth you must kill, and for one's soul one cannot kill? Who will answer it?" 89. Savinkov imparts to Lukács the revelation, salvation lies in sacrificing one's own soul rather than in the intellectual aesthetic creation or redoing of the soul. But the consecration of the soul to a cause, sanctioning terror and violence, for Lukács also gives concrete meaning to the tragic, namely the revolutionary is impelled to sacrifice his individual ethic for the collective ethic. It is against this tragic paradox that I wish to analyze Lukács's conversion, concentrating on his publications and statements during 1918–1919. In mid-1918, Lukács wrote to Paul Ernst that his personal fate is more than problematic. He adds that his personal fate and the fate of the world could only be expressed in a book or lengthy conversation. 90 The convergence of personal and historical fate in the Bolshevik Revolution sets the final scene for the problematic individual's conversion, credo quia absurdum, into a revolutionary figure. In March 1918, during a famous debate on conservative and progressive idealism, 91 Lukács makes it unmistakably clear that his conversion will be on ethical moral grounds. Commenting on the relationship between ethical idealism and politics, he asserts the primacy of ethical idealism over political activities. He declared, "Ethical idealism, inasmuch as it is directed towards politics, cannot aim at anything else than the creation of institutions congruent with its ideal and the removal of those that stand in the way of the ideal's realization." 92 To Lukács it was inconceivable that any institution qua institution could serve the values of ethical idealism inherent in Kant's categorical imperative. Consequently, political revolution is the means and moral revolution the end. His call for a moral revolution deserves a full quote, Ethical idealism denotes a permanent revolution. It opposes existence as existence and is against all things lacking ethical values. It is a permanent revolution because it is an absolute revolution, capable of determining the direction of the ever-active, never-stagnating development of the ethical ideal. 93 It is important to note that up to 1918, Lukács, despite his sporadic experimentations with Marxism, rejected socialism on ethico-religious grounds. For instance, in the modern drama, he drew a negative comparison between Christianity and Marxism. The first gave the floundering pagan culture the Bible and, through it, a spiritual moral fulfillment of the soul. By contrast, socialism is devoid of that soul-filling strength that characterized early Christianity. 94 Consequently, Lukács's leap of faith into communism in December 1918 astonished even those who knew him well. What, asked the communist writer, J6 have Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor and Kierkegaard's either or to do with the revolution? 95 Lajos Kasich, on the other hand, vividly captured Lukács's leap of faith into communism. 96 Kasich pointed out that the same Lukács, who a few days earlier wrote about communism's lack of ethical base, was now writing editorials for the Vörös Ujjazd, Red Gazette, official organ of the Hungarian Communist Party. Kasich was referring to Lukács's article, Bolshevism as a Moral Problem, published in the special December 1918 issue of Szabadsándolát, Free Thought. Here Lukács spells out the moral dilemma of communism, based on the contradiction between Marx's sociological postulate and his ethical ideal. Sociologically, Marxism merely inverts the class struggle, the oppressed become the oppressors. But the ethical ideal of socialism, Lukács argues, calls for the realm of real freedom. To Lukács, the proletarian victory is but the precondition, negative at that, of socialism's will to democratic world order. 97 The moral problem of socialism is that its sociological postulate cannot support the ethical will to a new world order. Consequently, the quest for ethical and democratic values confronts socialism with a dilemma. According to Lukács, the fascinating power of Bolshevism resides in its promise to release socialism from this dilemma. He revealed his innermost conviction when he wrote, I repeat, Bolshevism is based on the metaphysical presupposition that good can come from bad, that it is possible, as Razumian said in Crime and Punishment, to lie our way to truth. The writer of these lines cannot share this faith. Hence he sees insoluble moral dilemma in the basic position of Bolshevism. 98 When this statement appeared in print, Lukács was already member of the party. 4. In January 1919, Lukács published his Tactics and Ethics, in which he diagnosed his decision to join the party. As a communist, Lukács had the intellectual integrity to accept moral responsibility for terror. But he also claimed to have a solution to the ethical problem, since adherence to the correct tactics is in itself ethical. 99 At the same time, he affirmed that his conversion was based on ethical considerations. Lukács saw his conversion as an answer to a tragic fate. He wrote, ethical self-awareness makes it quite clear that there are situations, tragic situations in which it is impossible to act without burdening oneself with guilt. But at the same time, it teaches us that, even when faced with the choice of two ways of incurring guilt, we should still find that there is a standard attaching to correct and incorrect action. That standard we call sacrifice. 100 Lukács's choice of communism, I suggest, must be viewed in terms of response and sacrifice. His conversion was the response to a profound human tragedy he defined by quoting Hebel's Judith, even if God had placed sin between me and the deed enjoined upon me, who am I to be able to escape it? 101. Nunescape from sin and deed involved the soul's sacrifice for a movement that Lukács faulted on moral and metaphysical grounds. Bela Balázs knew that his friend had made a tragic choice. During their Vienna exile, Balázs wrote, Lukács the conspirator, the political activist, the revolutionary, is assuming a mask. It is not his metaphysically rooted mission. He was born a quiet scholar, a lonely sage. Lukács, the lonely sage, belongs to the second part of this article. Space limits me to a mere sketch of his works on aesthetics. The reason for this imbalance is that my main concern is with how Lukács reached Marxism rather than with what he accomplished as a Marxist thinker. The latter aspect has been treated exhaustively in Leszek Kolakowski's recent work. L03 My intent here is limited to an elaboration of the internal consistency of Lukács's early and late works on art and aesthetics. Lukács's principal work, Die Eigenart des Ästhetischen, hereafter cited as Aesthetics, 1963, shows a thematic continuity with his Heidelberg Aesthetics, 1912. The continuity of the two works, despite the change in political perspective following Lukács's conversion, is provided by a normative approach to reality and to art. As I have tried to show, in his early works Lukács uses Platonic immanence and transcendence to engage in aesthetic investigation. In building palaces of ideals here on earth, Lukács does not even attempt a synthesis between experience and the eternally given forms. His concept of form is influenced by Plato. But for the Marxist Lukács the form becomes totality, modeled after Hegel. There are certain similarities between Lukács's Aesthetics, 1963, and Hegel's Aesthetics. Both share the view that the vocation of art is to unveil the truth in the form of artistic and, therefore, sensuous configuration. And both idealize Greek art and ideals. But the differences between Hegel and Lukács are also subtle and important. Whereas Hegel was preoccupied with lyric poetry and, in effect, it enjoys a high rank in his system because poetry is the medium for inward subjectivity so characteristic of bourgeois society, Lukács remained aloof from poetry all his life. The objective genres, epic and drama, occupy a high place in his hierarchy of values precisely because both are manifestations of the crisis in the human order. More important, whereas Hegel's Aesthetics deals only with the problem of representing the complex totality of modern life in literature and art, Lukács postulates that in bourgeois culture this totality is completely absent. Consequently, and herein lies the subtle continuity between the early and late Lukács, the empirical reality needs an Urbild or a Platonic demiurge to impose norms on meaningless reality. Lukács's consistently normative approach to reality explains the internal consistency between his neoclassicism and Marxist cultural orthodoxy. Whether one reads his early works or his mature works, there is a persistent attempt to confront the meaningless present with an ought. This is the primary source of his stubborn anti-modernism in art, which is evident in the adversary stance of Bertolt Brecht and Lukács. L04 Brecht, as well as Walter Benjamin, rejected Lukács's classicism and its hostility to modern art. In 1932, Lukács objected to Brecht's anti-Aristotelianism, that is, his anti-classicism. And in 1938, Lukács and Brecht clashed over expressionism in art. In the pages of Das Wort, Lukács argued that socialist realism is an extension of critical realism, developed by the great geniuses of bourgeois literature. Brecht flatly rejected that bourgeois literature is compatible with proletarian values. In his Aesthetics, 1963, Lukács returned to his criticism of Brecht, objecting to the latter's alienation effect as an aesthetic device. To Lukács, as he made explicit in his modern drama, a Weltanschauung grows organically out of reality, and, hence, the artist can and must find an adequate artistic form to express it. But worldview is integrative and never expressive of alienation. This is consistent with Lukács's general view that all valuative human endeavors, magic, religion, philosophy, and art are but different ways to reflect reality. In correlating art and reality, he borrows Aristotle's principle, Poetics 1447a 1449b, of imitation and representation. Through mimesis, Aristotle subordinates art to a higher reality. To Lukács, however, there is only one unified anthropomorphic reality. In his posthumous work, The Ontology of Social Being, Lukács contends that labor not only produces history and art but that it is the key to the ontology of being. Here Lukács merely restates Vico's thesis that the principles of civil society, since it is the creation of men, are grounded in the modifications of the human mind. In sum, the man-made social world is accessible to knowledge and evaluative understanding. The implication of Vico's insight for Lukács is obvious. If laboring man creates the total world of facts and values, then that world is open to artistic aesthetic evaluation. Up to this point, Lukács's argument is tenable. The problem begins when Lukács tries to prove in the Aesthetics, 1963, that art reflects reality evaluatively. One of the major discoveries of Lukács the Marxist is that the present must be seen as history. A historicized present, as is evident in history and class consciousness, not only makes human reality social but also raises the question of the objectivity of reason for, as Lukács put it, we is not only the subject of history but the action of we is in fact history. The social situation of the bourgeois imposes limitations on speculative thought. In Hegelian language, the content cannot find an adequate form that would transcend what Lukács called the antinomies of bourgeois thought. 105 But Lukács exempts great art from the general limitation that alienated reality imposes on human thought. Whereas Kant exemplifies the antinomies of modern thought, Lukács argues that Greek philosophy and art were exempt from what is subsumed under the reification process. Not only did Kant fail to resolve the antinomies but, Lukács argues, he fixed them for eternity. 106 Throughout the Aesthetics, 1963, Lukács expands on his central theme, in contradiction to the general thesis of history and class consciousness, that art expresses the organic unity of the human personality and its destiny in the world. He also asserts that art is not only the seeing, hearing, feeling organ of humanity but also its memory. The result of the mimetic concept of art is that literary geniuses can express the reality behind reality, the becoming of reality. This creates a problem. If realism aims at objective representation of social reality, how, then, can the depicted reality contain a purpose? Either one or the other is possible but certainly not both. Even from a dialectical viewpoint, reality and social purpose are two distinct entities. One is attained, from a common sense standpoint, by description, the other, by prescription. V. In conclusion, some critical remarks should be made on Lukács's selective interpretation of the past. Consistent with his general position that art serves a purpose and codes a teleology, Lukács has transformed Walter Scott into a literary expositor of Marxist history, 107 but he has ignored the inward scope of Proust and denounced Joyce's art as bourgeois narcissism run wild. As for Lukács's literary judgments, in one breath he can bow to hold Erlin and praise Lenin. He has compared Paul Ernst to Sophocles 08 and considered Friedrich Hebel's tragic vision as more organic than Shakespeare's. 109 Finally, there is his enthusiasm for Solzhenitsyn. 110 Lukács's obsession with the literary image of crisis leads him to appraise Solzhenitsyn as the principal exponent of socialist realism. Even more extraordinary, he remarked to a Soviet friend that Solzhenitsyn is a plebeian Democrat and not a Marxist communist. All these instances point up the basic flaw in Lukács's didactic literary values. To the very end, he judged the literary merit of an artwork by the purpose it served. What his Marxist aesthetics in effect amount to. 107 Lukács, Walter Scott, in Wildgerodelem World Literature, 2 volumes. But is a provocative, often brilliant, advocacy of aesthetic education. The most engrossing aspect of Lukács is his unequivocal insistence that socialism is not a scientific necessity but, first and foremost, a choice of value. Kant gave moral imperative for practical reason. Marx gave practical reason for socialism. Lukács labored for half a century to impart cultural and aesthetic reasons to Marxism. This chain constitutes, broadly speaking, what he liked to refer to as the Renaissance of Marxism. But Lukács's choice of communism prevented him from drawing a distinction between self-liberation and self-enslavement. One could, perhaps, assign a share of his tragedy to the age in which his either-or choice fell. Yet there is no need to equivocate. In his old age, Lukács admitted, "My life has been a failure." If tragic fate hung over his life, it continues beyond his grave. After the 1968 Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, Bertrand Russell approached Lukács to sign a collective letter of protest. Lukács declined since it might compromise the cause of socialism. Nonetheless, the lonely sage Lukács did write an essay, entitled Democratic Pamphlet, where he concluded that the Soviet Union is a socialist country only in name. This essay is locked away and will not be made public until 2021. Lukács started out as an essayist because he wanted to judge the sinful bourgeois world. As his final and ultimate sacrifice to communism, he decided not to publish his last essay. Lukács once said, "Plato knew exactly why he burned the tragedy he wrote in his youth. But we also know why our generation cannot read Lukács's last essay. Tragic life is crowned only by its end," he wrote at 25.112. In the end, Lukács is a tragic figure because resolute sacrificial acts and self-denials for the sake of superior values may also be the very essence of tragedy.